I thought the sterile smell of the hospital and the ache of my incision were the worst pains I would ever face. I was wrong. My name is Susan Jones, and I had just survived a life-threatening emergency, but the real threat was waiting in my recovery room. They walked in my entire family, not to wish me well, but to deliver a sentence they had sold my downtown Denver condo, the one thing that represented my hard-won independence for pennies. The truth hit me with a force that made the high-rise lights blur. I was trapped vulnerable and betrayed by the very people sworn to protect me. Now stripped of my freedom, I had to fight back from a hospital bed. How far would you go to reclaim the life they stole? Like, share, comment, and subscribe to our channel. We always appreciate the time you spent here with us. The scent of fresh-cut lumber and expensive coffee used to be my morning ritual. Not anymore. Now it was the sterile metallic air of St. Jude's, the beep of machines, and the ghost ache of my surgical scar. But 2 weeks ago, before the appendix rupture nearly killed me, my world was that condo. Downtown Denver, 11th floor. It wasn't huge 2 beds, exposed brick, and a wall of windows that pulled the entire Rocky Mountain range right into my living room. That condo was a testament to every late night, every skipped vacation, every digital marketing campaign I crushed over a grueling 10 years. It wasn't just real estate. It was the physical proof that Susan Jones didn't need saving. I had bought my freedom dollar by hard-earned dollar. The mortgage was mine, the decisions were mine, and the silence was glorious. My parents, Helen and Robert, and my older brother, Victor or Vic, never saw it that way. To them, my success was less a triumph of resilience and more a temporary resource that needed to be managed by them, of course. They operated under the oppressive guise of a family collective, a philosophy that meant I earned and they spent. Vic especially had always been the golden boy who could do no wrong, even as he quietly accumulated catastrophic debt from a mix of failed business ventures and a truly unhealthy gambling habit I had only recently begun to suspect. Whenever I spoke of my finances, their eyes would glaze over with a familiar patronizing pity. "You're too young to be so focused on material things, Susan." Mom would sigh, ignoring the fact that my material thing was financial independence. My sudden collapse was a terrifying, violent shock. The doctors called it a miracle I survived the sepsis. My recovery in the post-op unit had been slow, isolating, and punctuated by the kind of deep, draining exhaustion that leaves you too weak to even think. It was during a quiet Tuesday afternoon, the low sun slanting through the blinds, that I heard the door click open. I shifted my head slightly, my body protesting the movement. It wasn't a nurse, it was Vic. He sauntered in, impeccably dressed, a smirk twitching at the corner of his mouth. No flowers, no, "How are you?" Just a cold, empty superiority that sent a shiver down my spine, despite the room's warmth. He sat down heavily on the visitor's chair, crossing one expensive Italian leather shoe over the other. He didn't look at me. He looked past me at the wall. "Good, you're awake," he said, his voice gratingly casual. "We need to talk about the apartment." The silence that followed wasn't quiet. It was deafening, the low hum of the machines suddenly sounding like a ticking clock. I knew instantly that something terrible was coming. Vic turned his head, his eyes finally meeting mine, and that's when I saw the sheer calculated cruelty. "We decided to sell the Denver place," Vic announced, adjusting his tie, looking more like he was pitching a stock than delivering a devastating blow. "Don't look like that, Susan. It was necessary. I handled the paperwork, a standard power of attorney. You weren't using it, really. Now that you're out of the hospital, you'll be recovering at home, which means Mom and Dad's house. We simplified things." He leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "I got $65,000 cash for it. A clean sale. The rest of the equity well that's being managed to stabilize family finances." The sheer arrogance of the number $65,000 for a fully renovated downtown Denver condo I'd just had appraised at nearly $500,000 stole the breath from my lungs. I felt a dizzying wave of nausea, the fluorescent lights above us mocking the quiet horror of the moment. This wasn't just theft. It was the cruelest violation of my hard-won independence, a calculated move to strip me of my adult life while I lay helpless. The words simplified, cut deeper than the incision in my side. Before I could form a coherent word, the door swung open and in swept my mother Helen, followed by my father Robert and my sister, who offered a sickly sweet smile. They were a unified front, their faces radiating a smug satisfaction. "Your brother did what was best for the family, Susan," Mom said, crossing her arms over her chest. "He saved you the trouble of dealing with finances while you're frail. You should be grateful for our help." My sister rolled her eyes. "Oh, come on, don't be dramatic. It's just a place. We're a family." Their voices, their dismissal of my years of sacrifice turned my shock into a burning, white-hot fury. I tried to speak to scream, but only a dry, rattling sound escaped my throat. I felt a terrifying, paralyzing stillness wash over me. They expected the tears. They expected the collapse. They were waiting for me to be the weak, dependent little sister they always thought I was. But in that moment, something inside me snapped and hardened into steel. My focus sharpened with a cold, surgical precision. They kept talking, oblivious to the silence I had weaponized. My hands, hidden beneath the thin hospital sheet, found the small drawer next to the bed. My fingers closed around my phone. Without looking, I hit the record button. I settled back against the pillows, allowing a small, weak smile to touch my lips as I listened. Vic continued to brag about how easily he forged the power of attorney. My father joked about the speed of the transaction. My mother reiterated their right to make decisions for me. I captured every single damning word, a perfect, arrogant confession. The moment they finished their triumphant monologue and finally filed out, leaving their artificial perfume lingering in the air, I pressed stop. I was still weak, still sore, but the paralysis was gone, replaced by a singular, icy resolution. I looked at the ceiling. "You took your turn," I whispered into the quiet air of the hospital room, my voice flat and completely steady. "Mine comes next, and it won't be quiet." The moment I was discharged from St. Jude's, I didn't go to my parents' house, the safe haven Vic had condescendingly offered. Instead, I had a trusted friend take me directly to the high-rise office of Dana Velez. Dana wasn't just any lawyer. She was a litigation powerhouse sharp as glass, with a reputation for mercilessly dissecting corporate fraud. I didn't waste time on pleasantries or tears. I handed her the phone, hit play on the recording, and watched her face transition from professional reserve to cold fury. "They sold your home, Susan?" Dana stated, her voice tight, "while you were incapacitated using a forged power of attorney. This isn't a family squabble, it's a felony." I nodded, the phrase family squabble, sparking a brief, hateful fire in my chest. "I want it all back, Dana. Every brick, every dollar, and I want them to face the consequences." I didn't want mediation. I wanted justice, cold and absolute. We spent the next 8 hours building the initial framework for the counterattack, a methodical, surgical plan designed to hit them where they lived, their pride and their finances. We both agreed we had to act fast before the money vanished completely. The following days were a blur of adrenaline and pain. My body still ached from the surgery, but my mind was an engine of singular focus. I dragged myself through stacks of paperwork, pulling out every financial record, every bank statement, and the official property deeds for the Denver condo. I went through old emails to pull up the original appraisal, proving the true value of the home was over 7 times the pathetic amount Vic had claimed. Dana handled the legal filings, but I was the researcher fueled by a relentless, chilling anger. I realized in one dizzying morning spent poring over my closing documents that I had overlooked something my family in their arrogance had certainly overlooked too. Tucked away in the dense condominium association covenants was a little-known clause requiring the association's legal counsel to review and stamp any power of attorney related to the sale of a unit, a safeguard designed to prevent quick, cash-only flipping. Vic had bypassed them, entirely sealing his own fate by failing to dot a single obscure I. Meanwhile, the charade of concern continued. My mother called daily, leaving sickly sweet messages demanding to know where I was staying and why I hadn't come home. They completely failed to grasp the severity of the legal trap I was setting. They simply assumed I was sulking, crying into my pillow, and that I would eventually emerge humbled and dependent. Their arrogance was blinding. I kept my answers vague, maintaining a polite, distant silence, which only seemed to fuel their self-righteous indignation. I was the one who was being dramatic and ungrateful. I was playing the role of the wounded victim they expected, all while handing Dana the blueprint for their destruction. The next critical step was tracing the money. Dana immediately brought in Marcus Reed, a PI and forensic accountant known for his quiet, unrelenting persistence. Marcus's first priority was to track the $65,000 cash transaction Vic had boasted about. His preliminary report, delivered via secure email 2 days later, was sobering. The money hadn't been deposited into a clean account for family finances. It had been almost immediately cashed out and converted through a series of complex, hurried transactions. Vic was scrambling to launder the stolen funds, desperate to cover his tracks and ensure the money was untraceable. This wasn't just opportunism. This was calculated high-level fraud, confirming my suspicion that Vic's urgent needs were far worse than I had imagined. The news from Marcus galvanized our timeline. We couldn't wait for a slow civil suit. We needed the court to intervene now. The family's arrogance, their smug belief in their own untouchability, had given me the evidence, but their criminal haste threatened to put the recovery funds out of reach. "They're running, Susan," Dana said during our video call, her voice grim. "This isn't just about paying off debt, this is panic. They are actively trying to make the money disappear, which is a massive escalation of the crime. We have to file the emergency injunction to freeze any associated accounts and place a lien on the condo immediately. If we don't, we lose the money. You understand? This is the point of no return. Once we file, the police and the prosecutor get involved, and the entire family will know you are coming for them." My stomach knotted, but not from fear, from the intense surge of power. I looked at the image of the Denver skyline on my laptop screen, the physical embodiment of my personal freedom. They had tried to steal that freedom. They had tried to turn my resilience into their profit. "File it, Dana," I said, my voice steady, the adrenaline humming. "File the injunction. I am ready for the storm." I closed the laptop, the screen reflecting my face, no tears, no weakness, only a terrible, focused clarity. The silent war was over. The overt war was about to begin. The final pieces of evidence were coming together: the forged signature analysis, the condo documents, the cash liquidation trail. Dana's words echoed in my head. "We have about 6 hours until the federal marshals can legally act. Are you ready to go all the way, Susan?" I looked at my phone, the tiny recorded file of their confession resting safely in a cloud account. Yes, I was more than ready. Marcus Reed, my quiet, unrelenting PI, delivered the full report on Vic's financial dealings, and the file landed on my virtual desk like a lead weight. It detailed Vic's descent into ruin, a failed, over-leveraged tech startup, followed by reckless investments, and finally a breathtaking amount of money lost through a known offshore sports gambling account. The debt wasn't just substantial, it was catastrophic, far exceeding the equity in my condo. The discovery was like looking into a black hole of greed. It confirmed everything. This wasn't about family savings or simplifying my life. And it was a desperate, self-serving act of predatory opportunism, with my parents Helen and Robert acting as complicit shields. My sorrow finally evaporated, replaced by a pure, cold rage. The betrayal was total. With the injunction filed and the family's assets temporarily locked down, the psychological warfare began immediately. The legal action ripped the mask of normalcy right off them. My phone became a conduit for their emotional manipulation. My mother Helen, who used to preach about forgiveness, sent text messages that were masterpieces of victim blaming. "You are destroying this family, Susan," one read. "Your brother was just trying to help. We are family, and family sacrifices for family. Blood is thicker than water, and you're proving you have none." The hypocrisy was staggering. My father Robert took a more insidious approach, making calls to my professional contacts, trying to spread rumors that my recent illness had left me unstable and incapable of handling major accounts. He was actively trying to damage my career, a brazen attempt to strip me of my last vestiges of financial power. They were simultaneously claiming I was too fragile to manage money and too vicious to be a daughter. I forwarded every single text and detailed every smear attempt directly to Dana. Each message wasn't a wound, but another brick in the legal wall closing around them. Dana and I, meanwhile, were deep in the weeds of the paper trail. I spent 2 consecutive 14-hour days at her office, driven by a manic energy, organizing the mountain of documentation. We cross-referenced my valid purchase closing papers with the fraudulent deed filed by Vic. The contrast between my meticulously signed witness documents and the sloppy, hurried forgery was damning. The analysis of the forged signature was particularly satisfying. The expert report highlighted the hurried, unnatural strokes Vic's desperate attempt to replicate my handwriting. This methodical intellectual pursuit, the focus on facts, dates, and evidence, was my outlet. It was a reaffirmation of the American values they thought they could steal: resilience, the quiet strength to rebuild, and personal agency, the right to claim ownership over my life and my property. I was using the system of justice, the very foundation of my country's promise, to reclaim what they had tried to violate. The most satisfying progress came from the third-party fallout. The current owner of the condo, a clean-cut developer who thought they had snagged a quick deal, was served with the notice of the fraudulent sale and temporary restraining order. They became immediately irate. They weren't just a buyer now. They were an angry, inconvenienced third-party witness who was legally bound to stop occupying my home. They started pressuring Vic and my parents, demanding the return of their down payment, forcing the Jones family to admit the fact of the fraud to an external public-facing entity. The control the family had maintained over their narrative that this was all my dramatic fault was beginning to crumble. Vic's final, most desperate move was revealed in Marcus's next update. Vic had transferred a large final sum, the last of the liquid cash he controlled, to an obscure numbered account in the Cayman Islands. It was a flagrant move of concealment. Dana read the update with a sharp intake of breath. "That's it, Susan," she said, leaning across her massive mahogany desk, her eyes narrowed. "That transfer is proof of intent to conceal assets, a serious escalation. We have established motive, documented the forgery, and now we have proof of flight. They have left us no choice. We are moving beyond the civil suit." She paused, her voice hardening. "I am submitting the full file to the state prosecutor's office tonight. We're asking for arrest warrants for conspiracy, forgery, and grand theft. This is no longer just about getting your home back. This is about accountability." My jaw clenched, my pulse drumming hard in my temples. I looked out Dana's high-rise window at the city skyline. The sky was the color of bruised plums, heavy with coming rain. I was tired, my body still protesting, but the exhaustion was overridden by a relentless cold clarity. My family was going to prison. Good. I said the word, barely a whisper, yet carrying the weight of a final decree. Dana gathered her folders. "They're running out of room, Susan. We have them trapped, but this is when they will fight the dirtiest. They'll try to contact you to plead, to threaten. Do not engage. You must be untouchable. The legal net is tightening, and the arrest warrants are the final knots." I drove away from Dana's office that night under a sky that had opened up into a violent downpour. I checked my text messages one last time. A new one from Vic, a single, desperate, uncharacteristic plea. "Call me, please. This is a mistake. I'll explain." I deleted the message, then deleted the number. They had chosen their path of betrayal. I had chosen my path of justice. The only thing left to do was wait for the hammer to fall. Cliffhanger. I pull up to my safe house apartment and check my secure email. A new message from Dana. Subject: warrant status. Inside a single blunt sentence, the prosecutor is reviewing the final draft. We expect approval within 24 hours. The clock had started ticking on their freedom. We have 6 hours, Susan. Dana's voice was a sharp edge over the phone. That last transfer to the Caymans, that was the final warning shot. We file the full criminal complaint now, or we might as well write them a thank you note for stealing your life. I confirmed my readiness. This wasn't a choice anymore. It was an inevitability, a necessary surgery to excise the cancer of their betrayal. I felt a surge of cold, focused resolve. The final move was on. The next few hours were a breathless whirlwind of legal action. Dana and I worked side by side in her office, driven by an almost frantic energy. We pored over the documentation one last time, the forged signature analysis, Marcus's meticulously tracked banking logs, and the explicit transcript of the hospital recording. Every piece of paper was a nail in the coffin. We were specifically aiming to secure a federal warrant requiring a stronger burden of proof due to the interstate nature of the money laundering attempt. The clock was our enemy. We knew Vic was scrambling, attempting a last-minute wire transfer to complete the concealment. The very intensity of our effort was fueled by his desperation. While Dana finalized the legal request, I focused on preparing my court statement. I didn't write a tearful victim's plea. I wrote a detailed factual account of my journey to independence and how they had violently ripped away my right to self-determination. I focused not on the dollar amount, but on the profound violation of trust and the fundamental destruction of my independent identity. I articulated the American value they had betrayed, the pursuit of happiness and the protection of private property, emphasizing that my home was the core of my personal freedom. My emotional clarity was complete. I was no longer the wounded little sister. I was the empowered plaintiff, acting with full agency. The anticipated psychological warfare arrived right on cue. My phone buzzed constantly. It was Vic. He was hysterical, moving beyond the smug arrogance to sheer terror. He sent a flurry of texts. It was Mom's idea. We can just settle, I'll give you the $65 back. Then the pivot to threats, desperate and weak. You sue your brother, you'll never see another penny from this family, Susan. Don't be an idiot. I simply copied his texts and forwarded them to Dana. Then I chose my own final devastating act of severance. I called him back. He answered instantly, his voice a pathetic, shaky mess. Susan, thank God, listen, we can fix this, just... I cut him off, my voice perfectly level, utterly devoid of emotion. You can't fix a felony, Vic. You signed the papers. I paused, then played back a 10-second snippet of the hospital recording, the part where he laughed about forging the signature. The silence that followed was more eloquent than any shouting match. It was the sound of his world ending. He stammered a broken, pathetic cry. You wouldn't do this to your own brother. You did it first, I said, and calmly ended the call. The final thread of family loyalty was severed not with a tear, but with a dial tone. The night wore on. I was staying at a secluded apartment belonging to a colleague, ensuring my family couldn't find me. Marcus Reed was already in position. He had set up discreet surveillance at the family home, positioning himself to capture evidence of them attempting to destroy documents or flee. This was the moment of quiet tension before the explosive climax. I opened the secure feed Marcus had shared with me. The image was grainy but clear enough, the familiar suburban house, the porch light glowing. I could see my father's shadow moving behind the living room window. They were completely oblivious to the legal hammer poised to drop. I watched them, completely removed, as if viewing characters in a distant, doomed play. I saw my mother briefly step out to water a potted plant, looking utterly normal, utterly complacent. The contrast between their everyday actions and the monumental legal crisis about to engulf them was chilling. They were laughing over something inside, unaware that an army of federal marshals and Denver police were preparing to move on their address. I felt no satisfaction yet, only the grim determination of the executioner. Marcus sent a final text. Warrant is being processed by the presiding judge now. Stand by. The atmosphere in Dana's office was electric, taut with anticipation. We sat in silence, watching the clock tick down to midnight. Every minute was a lifetime. I visualized the moment the judge signed the order, the ink sealing their fate. This wasn't just justice for me. It was a loud declaration of personal freedom against the oppressive entitlement they had always used to control me. Then the final text arrived, short and stark, from Dana's liaison at the prosecutor's office. Cliffhanger. Final approval secured. Officers are being deployed to the address now. ETA, 15 minutes. I looked at the surveillance feed. The living room light was still on. I leaned back in my chair, closing my eyes, ready for the storm. My family was about to learn the painful cost of stealing my life. The text from the prosecutor's liaison hung on my phone screen. Officers are being deployed to the address now. ETA, 15 minutes. I looked up at Dana, who was already on a quiet, secure line with a supervising officer. The waiting room in her downtown office, usually a place of sterile calm, crackled with suppressed energy. I pulled up the private surveillance feed Marcus had set up. The suburban street was dark, the only movement the slow swing of a neighbor's porch light. I pressed my palm against the cool glass of the window, waiting for the first sign of the storm. At the 13-minute mark, it happened. A dark, unmarked sedan turned the corner, followed closely by a patrol car, lights flashing silently in the night. The vehicle stopped discreetly down the street. Uniformed officers, followed by 2 federal marshals in plain clothes, moved quickly and purposefully toward the house. The police action hit with a brutal cinematic precision. One officer hammered on the front door while another covered the side entrance. The movement inside was frantic. I could see the startled shadow of my father Robert flinching back from the peephole. A moment later, the door was wrenched open and the chaos began. My mother Helen appeared first, her face a mask of bewildered fury. She tried to physically block the doorway, her voice muffled but clearly rising in pitch. The officer remained calm, displaying the warrant. I watched her hand fly to her mouth, her eyes darting frantically. She was a woman whose entire identity rested on maintaining appearances, and now her carefully constructed world was collapsing on a live feed. My father, seconds later, came into view, his usual bluster replaced by a sickly pallor. He began arguing immediately, shouting about warrants and due process, his voice thick with disbelief that this legal catastrophe could possibly happen to him. Then came Vic. He burst into the entryway from the back of the house, his hair disheveled, his terror palpable. The moment he saw the uniformed figures and the marshals, the federal presence, his face seemed to cave in. The sheer shock on my family's face was not just about being caught, it was the blinding realization that I, Susan, their fragile, dramatic little sister, had orchestrated this devastating legal maneuver. They were stunned that I had been strong enough, ruthless enough to leverage the entire justice system against them. The officers were calm and professional. They read the charges: conspiracy, felony, forgery, and grand theft, and began the process of detention. Helen started sobbing, a theatrical, wrenching sound that was more about self-pity than remorse. Vic, however, completely disintegrated. He began sweating profusely, his hands trembling as the cuffs were placed on his wrists. The marshals escorted them out to the cars, their arrests broadcast live, only to me, the lone silent witness in Dana's office. Immediately, the frantic attempts to contact me began. My phone, which I had placed on a separate table, started buzzing with calls from blocked numbers and texts from relatives, my sister, my cousins, demanding to know what I had done. "You called the police on your own mother," one text screamed. "How could you ruin us?" I ignored everyone. Their cries were not those of repentance, but of entitlement being violently interrupted. Dana received a call from the supervising officer confirming that all 3, Helen, Robert, and Victor, were successfully transported and were being questioned separately at the precinct. This separation was the key to Dana's strategy. People who commit crimes together rarely share loyalty when faced with jail time. My attention focused on the updates from the precinct. This section detailed the family fracturing under questioning. The moment the questioning began, their unified front dissolved. The first domino was Vic. Cornered by the evidence of the forged power of attorney and the traceable bank transfers he thought he'd scrubbed, he cracked instantly. He started screaming that it was not his idea, claiming Father Robert was the one who pressured him to handle the details, and that Helen was the one who insisted on cashing out the funds immediately. The golden boy threw his parents under the bus in minutes, desperate to save himself from the deeper charges of money laundering. His collapse was total, pathetic, and predictable. Then came the parents. Helen stuck rigidly to her script, feigned ignorance. She insisted she knew nothing about the forged documents, claiming she believed Vic had my verbal permission to sell, trying to minimize her crime to mere complicity in a civil matter. But the detectives were ready. They had the section of my hospital recording where she clearly boasted about simplifying things and confirmed the sale details, evidence Donna had specifically provided to undermine her claim of ignorance. Her story started unraveling under the weight of her own recorded words. Robert fared the worst. When faced with the mounting evidence, the forgery, the money trail, and Vic's immediate betrayal, he retreated to a defense of toxic familial entitlement. He tried to justify his actions by claiming it was a father's duty to protect his son Vic and manage the finances of his immature daughter Me. He literally cited familial responsibility as a defense against grand theft, completely embodying the deeply twisted moral code of their family. "They are destroying each other," Dana summarized, hanging up from a call with the prosecutor. "Vic is blaming Robert. Robert is blaming Vic's desperation. Helen is trying to minimize her involvement. They are exactly where we need them to be, Susan. The evidence is solid, the motive is clear, and the internal betrayal is complete." I leaned my head against the cool glass, feeling a strange lightness. The outrage that had been a physical weight in my chest for weeks began to lift. This was more than just a legal victory. It was a profound declaration that my individual life, my personal freedom, and my agency were sovereign. Before I could process the gravity of the arrests, the final legal hammer fell. Dana's phone rang again. It was the prosecutor. The charges were formalized, and due to Vic's documented attempt to flee with the funds and the clear use of forgery, they were pushing for non-bailable felony charges for all three. Dana hung up and looked at me, her expression grim but satisfied. "They won't be coming home tonight, Susan. The prosecutor has all they need. They're going to hold them for a preliminary hearing. Vic, however, is demanding an immediate settlement hearing. He thinks he can still negotiate his way out of this even from a cell. He still believes you'll back down when you have to face him directly." I stood up, adjusting the coat over my healing body. My voice was calm, steady, ready. "Tell him I'll be there, Dana. I won't back down. I want to look him in the eye when he finally realizes he didn't just sell my apartment. He sold his own freedom." Cliffhanger. I walked out into the Denver night, the city lights shimmering through the residual rain. The news broke on a banner outside a skyscraper: "Prominent Denver family detained in property fraud investigation." The victory tasted metallic and cold, but it was absolute. The final confrontation was set. The preliminary settlement hearing was set for Monday morning. Vic thought he was being clever, pushing for an immediate confrontation, convinced that seeing his brother in a courtroom setting would trigger a wave of pity or guilt that would make me fold. He failed to understand that the person he was facing wasn't the weak post-op patient he'd mocked. It was Susan Jones, forged in the fire of betrayal and focused by the pursuit of absolute justice. This was the final, devastating act of the climax. I walked into the courtroom beside Dana, wearing a simple, tailored navy suit. I didn't look at the gallery where I knew my distant relatives and a handful of curiosity seekers sat waiting for the family bloodletting. My focus was singular: the defendant's table. Vic was there, flanked by a public defender, looking pale, the cockiness utterly gone. Helen and Robert sat beside him, their clothes wrinkled, their faces etched with exhaustion, and more damningly accusation. They looked at me not with remorse, but with pure cold hatred, the fury of the entitled, caught and exposed. The air in the courtroom was suffocating, heavy with the weight of shattered trust. I took my seat, my heart steady. I didn't feel rage anymore, just a profound, clinical distance. The prosecutor began laying out the factual foundation, the property's true value, the illegal transfer, and the immediate movement of funds to conceal the crime. Then it was my turn. I took the stand, placing my hand on the Bible with a steady calmness that surprised even Dana. I looked directly at the judge, avoiding Vic. Dana guided me through my testimony, focusing first on my background. I spoke of the years I had worked, the sacrifices, the double shifts, the bonuses, all devoted to buying that condo. I emphasized the Denver apartment not as a financial asset, but as the physical embodiment of my independent identity. That property, I testified, my voice clear and even, was the proof of my personal freedom. It meant I was an adult, autonomous, and free from the expectation of control. My family didn't just steal money. They committed a violent violation of my right to self-determination, a core tenet of American values. They waited until I was medically compromised in the most vulnerable moment of my adult life and systematically ripped away my hard-won success out of pure, arrogant entitlement. I detailed the discovery, the shock in the hospital, the feeling of paralysis, and the instant realization of their motive. Throughout my testimony, Vic avoided my gaze, shrinking visibly. Helen stared at me with unblinking hostility. Then the pivotal moment. Dana requested permission to enter the audio recording into evidence. "The recording is brief, Your Honor," Dana announced, "but it captures the defendant's self-incrimination, their clear intent, and their utter lack of remorse at the time of the offense." The prosecutor played the recording. The small courtroom speakers magnified Vic's smug voice, detailing the $65,000 figure. They amplified Helen's cold laughter about simplifying things. The air in the room seemed to freeze. You could hear the intake of breath from the gallery. The impact was immediate and devastating. Vic, who had been trying to maintain a facade of calm, crumbled. The sound of his own arrogance played back in the cold, neutral environment of a courtroom shattered him. He began to shake, then buried his face in his hands, muffled, hysterical sobs echoing through the court. I finally looked at him. I saw not the golden boy, but a desperate, broken thief. The breakdown was genuine, visceral, and irreversible. It wasn't remorse for me, but the terror of the consequences. His public collapse ended his facade forever. Helen and Robert watched their son fall apart, their faces shifting from anger to genuine, desperate fear. Following the audio, the forgery expert took the stand, methodically confirming that the power of attorney bore a deliberately and clumsily simulated signature. The forensic accountant then confirmed that the funds were almost immediately moved to a known offshore gambling account tied to Victor Jones, eliminating any defense of familial savings. The chain of evidence was flawless. Dana rose for her final argument, focusing on the sheer maliciousness of the timing. "They preyed on her weakness," Dana concluded, her voice ringing with indignation. "They confused their entitlement with a right to her hard work. They stand convicted by their own recorded words." The judge, a stern woman who had observed the proceedings with clinical detachment, finally spoke. She did not delay. "The evidence is overwhelming," the judge stated, her voice devoid of emotion. "The defendant, Victor Jones, aided by his co-defendants, engaged in a scheme of coordinated predatory familial fraud against a vulnerable party. This court finds that the core components of the sale are fundamentally void due to felony forgery and coercion." She delivered the final crushing ruling. 1. The sale is officially and irrevocably voided. The deed transferred to the buyer is canceled immediately. 2. Property title returns to Susan Jones, effective immediately. 3. Full restitution is ordered. All stolen equity plus penalties and damages for emotional distress and legal fees must be repaid by the defendants. 4. Criminal charges remain. Due to the severity and malice of the act, the court grants the prosecution's request to proceed with felony charges against all 3 defendants. As the gavel slammed down, the noise in the courtroom swelled, the startled gasps from the gallery, the frantic whispers of the public defender, and Vic's raw, guttural cry of despair. It was over. I stood up, gathering my papers. My legs felt slightly weak, but my spine was rigid. I looked toward the defense table one last time. Vic's face was slick with tears and sweat. Helen and Robert's eyes finally met mine, not the accusatory hatred of minutes prior, but a deep, sinking despair, the realization that I had not only won, but had destroyed their comfortable lives. I didn't smile. I felt a sudden, sharp, almost painful pang of sorrow for the loss of the family I wished I had, but it was instantly overwhelmed by the tidal wave of triumph. I had acted. I had fought. And I had won back the physical embodiment of my personal freedom. The prosecutor approached me. "Ms. Jones, you did the right thing." I nodded, the words unnecessary. I walked away from the courtroom, Dana by my side. Outside the courthouse, the steps were mobbed with local news cameras and reporters. I paused, taking a deep breath of the cool Denver air, letting the feeling of absolute victory wash over me before stepping toward the cameras for my single final statement. The reckoning was complete. Now came the healing. The air outside the courthouse was electric, a whirlwind of camera flashes and urgent shouts. I stopped on the top step, the full weight of my triumph pressing down on me. I saw the faces of the reporters, expectant, hungry for drama. I walked to the edge of the crowd, the cool air a balm against the courtroom's suffocating heat. This was my final stage, and I wouldn't waste it on tears or bitterness. I delivered my single statement, my voice carrying clearly above the din. My family violated the most basic tenet of human decency: trust. Family should protect you, not profit from your pain. This verdict is not just about a property deed, it is about every person's right to personal freedom and autonomy. I said nothing more, turning and walking away, leaving the chaos behind. A month later, I stood in my Denver condo. The air no longer smelled of sterile hospital cleaner or cheap cologne. It smelled faintly of fresh paint and possibility. The trauma had left shadows, but the space was now utterly peaceful. This was my homecoming. I sat on the floor, running my hand over the newly sanded oak. The sound of silence was the sound of catharsis. Shortly after the ruling, I called Dana and Marcus. I told them I couldn't simply go back to my marketing job. The experience had cracked me open, revealing a new singular purpose. We officially launched the Freedom Fund, a nonprofit dedicated to providing legal resources and financial awareness to individuals, particularly young adults, facing familial or financial fraud. My nightmare became the blueprint for others' empowerment, a testament to American resilience and the fight for community protection. Then came the inevitable final contact. 2 weeks after the trial, an envelope arrived. It was addressed in Helen's shaky script. The faint, artificial scent of her expensive perfume clung to the paper, a memory I wished I could scrub clean. I unfolded the letter. It was full of excuses, not apologies. It detailed their struggles, their humiliation, and the claim that Vic was desperate. It ended with a familiar, grasping plea. "Let's not destroy our family, Susan. Can we at least talk? We are your family." There was no anger left in me, only distance. I read the words once, folded the letter neatly, and walked to the kitchen. I dropped it into the trash. Block, silence, freedom. That was the new family motto. That evening, I stood on my balcony, the Denver lights glittering below me. I had reclaimed my life not through punishment, but by building a new foundation based on the very principles my family had violated. I was whole, free, and the quiet rhythm of my own heartbeat was the only sound I needed to hear. My story ended not with vengeance, but with peace. With the apartment reclaimed and the paperwork finally filed, Susan Jones closed the chapter on her betrayal, finding peace in her new foundation. That was the story of The Concrete Heart. If you felt the triumph or the rage, hit that like button now. Subscribe to Revenge Hour for more stories of justice and ultimate clarity, and tell us your thoughts below. We read every single one of your comments. Thank you for listening. This has been a story from Revenge Hour. We'll see you next time.